Start notes, is that all right? Start there?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, good morning. You all are stuck with me today. John's a bit under the weather, so I said, oh, I could just pop in. I'm retired now. I have time on my hands. So it's great to see a wonderful crowd for our lecturer who's traveled so very far today. A few notes before we begin. Tonight's trivia is canceled since John's under the weather. So if you know folks who typically attend trivia, if you could spread the word that there's no trivia tonight. Also this evening, we have two programs to keep you busy and running around. At 7 p.m. here in Orchestra Hall, we have a portrayal of an 1800s Lakeside lady who's come to visit Lakeside between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. It's our last of our historic portrayals. So that's in Orchestra Hall at 7 p.m. And then 8:15 or thereabouts, we'll have a silent movie in Hoover Auditorium with Clark Wilson. We do have a big rehearsal there this afternoon for New Horizons, the band camp that comes in for 3 days. And so it might be a few minutes after 8:15, but as quick as the crew can flip from that rehearsal that ends at 7:45, Clark will start at 8:15. And then a special note for a program on Wednesday that I'd like to highlight. We have a special exhibit in Hoover Lobby. If you haven't had the chance to see it this weekend, please drop in. But that morning at 10:30, Chuck Mintz, the photographer, will be doing a special session about that exhibition. It's titled Precious Objects, and it's 20 full-length portraits and a story to go with each of those individuals. So it's a very special exhibit there. So now on to today's program, the first in the Lakeside University lecture of this week. We have a special presenter traveling all the way from Elm Avenue, I understand, Bill Carlson. Poplar, oh my gosh, the last street in Lakeside that I don't know that. Peach Cherry, yeah, oh, Poplar. So Bill has been a reporter or editor with 5 Ohio newspapers, most notably the Cleveland Plain Dealer, where he covered government and political campaigns. He was editor of the National and Foreign News and supervised the Plain Dealer's Washington Bureau. Today's talk, as you can see there, is how the stolen election of 1876 affects us today. And he'll cover the history of the election of Rutherford Hayes and some laws that have changed more than once since that time. So if you would please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming our special presenter, Bill Carlson.
Thank you, Shirley. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be an unusual morning in one respect. I'm going to be talking about elections, but I promise I won't have any mention of the current political campaign, much to the relief of a number of you, I'm sure. You know, there are a lot of elections that we have. We're going to be talking about the election, as she said, of 1876, the most disputed, controversial election in our history until our last one. We'll also talk about elections and various events that led up to 1876 and some things that developed afterward. Well, as you know, there are a number of elections that have been close elections over the years. They're not new. We'll talk about a couple of them before we go forward here. First one I want to mention is in 1880, Ohio's James A. Garfield won the popular vote by the narrow margin of just 1%. But he managed to prevail overall because of a strong turnout in the electoral vote. 8 years later, we have Benjamin Harrison, born in Ohio, elected from Indiana, lost the popular vote to the incumbent Grover Cleveland, but he prevailed to win the election by winning the electoral vote. And then we come to one more close to our time, one that many of you will recall, the election of 2000, Vice President Al Gore and Texas Governor George W. Bush. Well, Gore won the popular vote by just 0.5%. Unfortunately for him, it was not enough to win the election. It was known that it was going to be a close election from the beginning. And on election night, the networks were all over the ballpark. First it was going to be, they called it for Gore, then they called it for Bush, then they said it was too close to call. And when the final official tallies came in a few days later, it indeed was too close. Too close to call, yes. And so Bush narrowly wins Florida and the unofficial tally, but it was so close that it triggered an automatic recount in every county in Florida. That took several weeks, and we came to hear a new term in political realm. Because they used punch card ballots, you put this card in a machine, and you put a stylus in, punch it next to the hole where the person you want to vote for. And as they were reviewing the ballots, they had to look, well, let's see, is this really a vote? And did they go all the way through? And they get these little pieces of cardboard that were hanging down, and we had the term hanging chads, if any of you remember that. So the recount went on, took several weeks, and when it comes back, Bush is declared the winner by a narrow margin. Well, Gore said he'd like to review a few more. He called for some recounts in four counties. This led to a legal battle there that went up to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court said, yes, Gore has a right to this recount. Bush immediately appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court to stop the recount in Florida. It got to the Supreme Court on December 8th, and the court immediately put a hold on the Florida recount. And on December 8th, within the next couple of days, they had oral arguments. And on December 12th, the court comes back with its decision. 5-4 decision, controversial in legal circles to this day. The court ruled that constitutionally fair recounts could not be completed by a certain deadline. And then according to federal law, the states have to resolve any disputes and have their final official tally by a certain date in December. And on that particular year, the date was December 12th, that day. And so therefore, the court said the Florida court decision is overruled, and thus Bush's victory in Florida was confirmed, a narrow victory out of nearly 6 million votes cast. Bush won by 537. Not 537,000, 537. Those 537 translated into all the electoral votes for Bush. He needed 270 to win nationally, and he won 271 and he wound up with 271 votes, the second closest election in our history. Well, you see, there's been a kind of a thread through these examples that I mentioned of the electoral vote. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Electoral College and the electoral vote. And before your eyeballs glaze over, I promise I won't get too deep into the weeds or get too wonky on this. But quite often when people start talking about electors and so forth, they say, why do we have this? How did we get here? Well, we have to go back to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. As our framers of the Constitution were trying to decide, how do we choose a president? And there were some framers of the Constitution that said, well, they had a particular view because at that time there was no structure of government, there were no political parties, and so some framers said, well, we ought to have the Congress elect the president, because the members of Congress would be in the best position to know who the best candidates are, who would be most qualified to be president. Therefore, we ought to have Congress elect the president. To which some people said, no. That would make the president subservient to Congress, beholden to Congress, and we want a separation of powers. So then some other people said, well, we want to be a democracy, so we should have a popular vote. To which some people said, yeah, but how are people up and down the land going to know who the best person is? And furthermore, if we have a popular vote, the vote in the big states will overwhelm the vote in the small states, and that's not fair, so we can't have that. So then there were some other ideas kicked around. Finally, the framers come up with a compromise, creation of this new creature, the elector. Now, in the original wording of and this was adopted in the original wording of the Constitution, it says that voters would have one vote, but electors would have two. And the first vote would be for their favorite choice for president. That would be their first vote. Second vote would be for their second choice for president. Well, this worked all right for the first couple of elections in our history. The first election, unanimous vote of the electors, George Washington for president. And then John Adams was chosen for vice president. 4 years later, next election, unanimous vote for Washington, Adams for vice president. We come to our third election. And of course, you all recall that Washington says, I'm a president, not a king. I'm not running again. And so Adams runs to succeed Washington. And when the returns come in, Adams has the most votes. He becomes president. And the runner-up was Thomas Jefferson. He becomes vice president. Well, on the surface of things, we're likely to say, hey, that's great. Two of our most prominent founding fathers there at the top of the government. But I'm sure there are a few history buffs among you out there that say, nah, this wasn't so great. Because there have been some changes in that 8 years since Washington was first inaugurated in office. We have the creation of political parties. Back at the Constitutional Convention, there were a number of framers who really had hoped the country wouldn't go the way of political parties. And Washington agreed with that because they thought that, well, it was antithetical to the idea of a democracy. It would be counterproductive, it would be divisive, et cetera. And they had hoped that it would just go with the may the best man win kind of thing. So we come to this election where Adams and Jefferson at the top, and we face the reality that they are of different political parties. Adams was a Federalist. Jefferson led the Democratic-Republican Party. They were rivals. They didn't agree on much of anything. They were often at odds. And so as the Adams administration progressed, members of Congress and others said, the Constitution needs to be fixed. And so we have the 12th Amendment, which says, well, the electors will still have 2 votes. One is for president and one is for vice president. And so thus it recognizes political parties and a chance for to have a ticket, and you have both people at the top there will be of the same political party. Well, who are these electors? The Constitution basically leaves the elector business up to the states. They only make 2 provisions regarding the electors. The Constitution said no member of Congress can be an elector, nor can a federal employee be an elector. Other than that, it can be anybody. So with the growth of political parties, the parties insisted on they would choose the electors, and states adopted laws to reflect this. These days, the electors are chosen mainly at state conventions of political parties. Some states also have a different method where they have some of the electors chosen in caucuses in the various congressional districts. And some states provide that certain public officials or party officials should be among the electors. Most of the electors are either party leaders, party activists, sometimes local or state officials, but basically they're people little known outside the world of politics, and even though an elector has a certain prestige in political circles. But nonetheless, they usually get very little attention even when they meet. Years ago in my reporting days, I covered a meeting of the Ohio electors after a presidential election. It was in December following the November election, and the electors met in the chamber of the Ohio House of Representatives in Columbus. The chamber holds 99 seats on the floor, and there were 30 or so people in attendance, electors, alternate electors, various dignitaries. There were a few remarks, some lighthearted remarks. This was a joyous time for the people who were there. The electors declared their vote. In this case, it was for Reagan and Bush 1 and for Reagan's first term. They signed some certificates. They're required by law and by the Constitution. Then the state must forward these certificates on to the President of the Senate, which is the Vice President, so he can preside over the joint session of Congress to certify the election. But mostly, this meeting just didn't get much of attention because it was just a formality. Nothing surprising happened. And in fact, even the January 6th gathering of the joint session of Congress rarely gets much attention unless a few minutes on TV, maybe a couple paragraphs in the New York Times, the Washington Post. The last January 6th was an exception. Usually the most visibility they get is to viewers on C-SPAN. So these electors are not very well known, and their meetings are not particularly gathering much attention. Sometimes, however, the electors, we have electors that don't keep the faith politically. They cast a rogue vote. They don't vote for the people they're supposed to vote for. And this has happened a number of times over the years, 90 or so for president, 60 or 70 for vice presidents. So I even have a name, faithless electors. Faithless electors. They've never affected the outcome of a total election at all, but nonetheless, they have happened from time to time. And when they do, they usually provide some interesting anecdotes, and we can talk about those later if somebody wants to bring that up. Well, as we all know, electors are chosen by states, and maybe it's overlooked how those electors, or how you decide how many electors a state gets. Well, it's based on the, I need to move this along here. Here, based on the congressional delegation. So as we know, every state has 2 senators, and then you add in the number of representatives to get the total of electors. So Ohio, for example, has 2 senators, 15 members of the House equals 17 electors. We all know, that there are large states and small states, and we know this intuitively. We've seen it around the country, but nothing drives it home quite so dramatically until you look at the number of electors per state. 6 states in the District of Columbia have the minimum, 3 electoral votes. A little over half the states have 10 or fewer. And then it jumps up, you get 11, 12. Several states in the teens, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and then you get to the big 4. New York, 28 electors. Florida, 30. Texas, 40. And the big kahuna, California, 54 electors. What a range, what a range. Big states and small states. Well, in most of the states, 48 states, it's winner take all. Whoever gets the most popular votes gets all the electors in that state. 2 exceptions, Nebraska and Maine, they have a proportional system. They award some of their electoral votes based on who wins congressional districts. Well, of course, the goal is to win a majority of the electoral votes nationally. But what if nobody gets the majority? What happens then? Well, as you recall, and probably know, the election then falls to the House of Representatives. It's happened twice in our history. And I initially was just going to mention that and go on because I want to refer to it later, but the stories surrounding that are too good, so I'm going to talk about these. The first time this happened was in 1800. John Adams runs for re-election and gets beat by his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson, with whom he's had many disagreements. We have the tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. That Aaron Burr, yes. They were actually running as a ticket. They're both Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson was supposed to be the presidential candidate and Burr the vice presidential candidate. But some electors forgot to withhold their votes for Burr so that Jefferson would definitely get the presidential election. And so they wind up with a tie. And it falls to the House of Representatives where each state gets 1 vote so that the big states don't overwhelm the small states. So we think that, okay, it goes into the House of Representatives, and of course they're going to elect Jefferson. Declaration of Independence and all that, the great Thomas Jefferson. Except that the House happened to be dominated by Federalists, and the Federalists were loath to vote into the presidency someone from the other party. And so as they voted, there was ballot after ballot of deadlock. And so some things happened. First of all, Burr decides that, hey, I was supposed to be vice president, but we tied. Maybe I could be president. He kind of tries to persuade people to vote for him. There was also, some historians say that Jefferson was trying to woo some votes, and he made it known to a congressman from Delaware that his position on a particular issue, and the Delaware Congress said, yeah, he might change the vote. But the real interesting part was the entry of Alexander Hamilton, Federalist founder. Comes in, looks at these top 2 guys and says, who's less objectionable than the other? Who's the lesser of the 2 evils? And he decides that that's Jefferson. So he goes to the Federalists in the House and starts lobbying and says, vote for Jefferson, not Burr, Jefferson. The ballots go on and on. They go to 35 ballots over about a week. By the 36th ballot, there's a breakthrough, and Jefferson is elected. Now, you know, without going into all this, you'd think that, well, Jefferson sails into the presidency. He barely made it. Fortunately for him, when he ran the second time, he was elected a lot easier. So that's the first time. We go through the 2 terms of President James Madison, 2 terms for President James Monroe, and we come to the election of our 6th president in 1824. Big vote getter Andrew Jackson, still viewed as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He wins the popular vote, leads in the electoral vote. Second is John Quincy Adams, son of the first Adams, big career in government, U.S. Senator, diplomat in 4 countries, Secretary of State under President Monroe. He's second. Secretary of the Treasury is third. Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, is fourth. So it goes to the House of Representatives. And the 12th Amendment, besides straightening out the president and vice president thing, also said that the House can only consider the top 3 candidates. So Clay falls off. But you get to the House of Representatives, and who's presiding? Well, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. And he knows that there's nothing in the Constitution or any of the amendments that requires the House to vote for the top vote getter, which pleases him no end because he despises Andrew Jackson. And he encourages and persuades the House to vote for John Quincy Adams. And that's how Adams became president. Footnote: Adams becomes president. He needs a Secretary of State. And who does he pick? Well, the president maker, Henry Clay. Jackson's furious, condemns this corrupt bargain, denounces Adams all over the place. 4 years later, Jackson and Adams face off again, and Jackson and Adams is defeated, marking the first time. So therefore, both Adams, father and son, serve only 1 term. When Adams becomes president, it's the first time in our nation's history that a person becomes president who has not won the popular vote. It's the first time among 5 in our nation's history that did not win the popular vote. Okay, time to move on. We've talked about the 2 cases where it went to the House of Representatives. Let's jump ahead to the 1870s. Who's president? Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, successful general. As president, not so much. He came into office, he's only in his 40s, he's a political novice, and he stumbles coming out of the gate. He doesn't really vet a lot of his cabinet appointees. One of them was dismissed shortly thereafter for a conflict of interest. Another quits after 3 or 4 months because it was taking too much of his time. I don't know if he thought it was a part-time job or what. Another one of his appointees was of ill health and died soon after at a young age. But one appointee who did work out well was his Attorney General, Amos Ackerman. Ackerman used the civil rights laws that were passed after the Civil War to aggressively go after the Ku Klux Klan. And he basically knocked them down for a couple of years. Now, we know they came back big time and ugly later on. But this particular step by Ackerman was a big plus for the Grant administration and for that era. Grant also thwarted an attempt to corner the gold market. He had some big plans to try to build a canal through Central America. You know, we know that didn't come about for another 40, 50 years. He attempted to reform civil service, but Congress wouldn't back his choice for the chairman of that board. One of several times that Congress had blocked some things that Grant wanted to do. He did send troops into the South a number of times to try to defend blacks against violence from white mobs, particularly when he sent some into New Orleans, and where he also had to prevent the seizure of the state government by the White League. So his first term is a bit of a mixed bag. He runs for re-election and wins in a landslide, carries 31 of the 37 states. Electoral vote is something like 286 to 66. Big win. So he rides into, so before he gets into office, there's some unusual things that happen after the election. His main opponent was Horace Greeley, a New York newspaper editor, famous for advising, "Go west, young man, go west." Well, November turns out to be a disastrous and tragic month for Greeley. First of all, he's trounced in the election. Then his wife died, and then he died. And that put the Greeley electors in a bit of a quandary. What's an elector supposed to do? Vote for a dead man? Well, 3 electors kept the faith and did that. Congress later threw him out because Greeley was no longer around. The other Greeley electors either abstained or scattered their votes among some of the other candidates. So Grant rides into his second term. He's riding high, big dreams for his second term. But those of you who know Grant's history know that there was another side to the Grant administration, a side that could be not so attractive, a side that could be summarized in one word, and that word is corruption. The big one was the whiskey ring, exposed late in the second term. In this case, a number of whiskey distillers and revenue agents conspired to deprive the government of millions of dollars in whiskey taxes. 110 people were convicted in the whiskey ring. And we have the Credit Mobilier of America, a name picked by the Union Pacific Railroad for a company that was going to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. Credit Mobilier in France is a very respected company, so they figure, okay, this will give some respect to this outfit, except that this was kind of a shell game here. And they also wanted to kind of grease the rails, so to speak, to get some favorable legislation in Congress. And so the railroad company persuaded a member of Congress to sell stock in the railroad at below market price, cheap price, to members of Congress, both vice presidents under Grant. He had one in one administration, one in another. And the idea was that, well, they'd buy low and sell high when the railroad was showing a big profit. This was going to be a big thing. Once that was exposed, 2 people in the Congress were censured, but that's all that happened. Then we have New York Customs House, just a cesspool of corruption and patronage abuses. We have a treasury agent who extorted money from companies claiming that they owed taxes where they didn't. He went to prison. We have an attorney general, not Ackerman, but one of his successors, accused of extortion. All this under the Grant administration. But that's not all. There's more. We have the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of War, who's essentially the Secretary of the Army. We have the Interior Secretary. We haven't reached into Grant's family, one of his brothers, his brother-in-law. Actually, one of these cases actually relates to our own time. As you recall, earlier this year, the U.S. House impeached a member of the current cabinet. The Senate refused to consider it, so the issue died. But in all the news stories, it said, first time in nearly a century and a half that a member of the cabinet has been impeached. First time in 150, et cetera, et cetera. And who was that person? Well, it was Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap. When Belknap realized that he was going to be impeached, he went running over to the I don't know if he actually ran over to the White House. He hurried over to the White House and submitted his resignation to Grant. The House ignored it. I impeached him anyway. The Senate, majority of the Senate, agreed that he was guilty on all counts. But the Senate couldn't reach 2/3 majority necessary to convict Belknap, and thus he got off. And in many ways, Belknap symbolized most of the people involved in these scandals here, except for the folks in the whiskey ring, except for the Treasury agent who went to prison. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was went to prison. Nobody was fined, much to the disgust and dismay of a lot of the American people. And through all this, somehow Grant remained above the fray. He was seen as, an island of integrity in a sea of corruption. And the reason for leading you through all this is that the sea of corruption provided the backdrop, the setting, and one of the big campaign issues leading up to the presidential election of 1876. The Democrats come into this election very confident of victory. They think they've got a winning candidate in a man known as a corruption fighter, the governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden grew up in a small town southeast of Albany, had some health problems when he was young, went off to Yale, health problems came back, and he never graduated from college. Years later, however, Yale gave him an honorary degree. Well, Tilden went from New Haven down to New York City, enrolled in law school, passed the bar exam, and became a very successful lawyer in New York. Mainly practiced corporate law, particularly with railroads, and became an expert in financial matters, so much so that he was even asked to advise some of New York's leading families on their financial matters. He acquired a lot of wealth, and when he died, he left a bulk of it to help found the New York City Public Library. Well, along the way, he gets involved in politics. He's elected to the state legislature as a Democrat. He serves on a state constitutional review and revision commission, and eventually, much later, becomes chairman of the state Democratic Party. Along the way, however, he splits with the Democratic machine that runs New York City politics. He decides that that's not for him because that machine operating out of Tammany Hall is the domain of one William Tweed, known as Boss Tweed to many people. Tweed also had served in the legislature. He also served in the city government, county government, a term in Congress, comes back from Washington and decides his future is with the party. And his constituency is mostly the immigrants, thousands of immigrants who come into New York City every year. And of course they need housing, they need jobs, they need various social services. And Tweed says, the party's going to provide this for them in return for their votes. Tweed supposedly said, I really don't care how they vote. What matters is who counts the votes. Well, while Tweed was helping other people, he was also helping himself. And years later, he and his cronies are accused of stealing millions of dollars from the city of New York. Kickbacks, bribes, bogus contracts, ghost employees, inflated billing practices. And as Tweed acquired more wealth, he started investing in private companies. A paper company that sold paper to City Hall. A marble company that provided marble for construction projects, even when they didn't. There was one project that was built entirely of wood, but a bill was submitted for marble and the bill was paid. Well, Tweed spread this money around a bit. He was said to own judges, cops, legislators, governors, mayors, councilmen, and he even shared it with some of the building trades as well there. This operation hummed along for a number of years. And then one day, one of the auditors in the city department died. Well, he was more than just an auditor. He was Tweed's chief bookkeeper. And when his successor came in along, he looked at it and said, no, this isn't right. And he started leaking information to the New York Times, which then began a series of investigative stories that ran for months in the early 1870s, outlining corruption at City Hall. Well, he was soon joined in all these stories in the Times by Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist for the Harper's Weekly. Nast ran, here's citizens of New York paying their taxes, and on the other side, Tweed symbolizes living it up with his friends. Who stole the people's money? He did, he did, he did. You know, there were other cartoons about, here's Tweed running from the law. Here's Tweed poised as a vulture overlooking New York City. And one of my favorite cartoons, the Tammany Tiger on the loose, attacking figures representing the rule of law, the republic, ballots. And here's Tweed sitting up there like a Roman emperor surveying the situation and enjoying it. Well, as a scandal erupted and as it grew, there was a group of 70 people that got together to try to reform the situation. And one of the leaders of this reform group was Samuel Tilden. Tilden drew on his expertise in law, his experience in law, his experience in government, and his expertise in financial matters. And he was the one who came up with a way to link the stolen funds, to trace the stolen money back to Tweed. And it was that breakthrough that enabled the authorities to indict and convict Tweed on more than 200 counts of fraud and embezzlement, and he was sent to jail. Well, Tilden received a lot of acclaim for helping bring down the powerful boss Tweed, and that acclaim led to Tilden being elected governor of New York. And what did he find when he got to New York? More corruption. This time in the operation of the state's canal system. Now, we've heard, of course, of the Erie Canal from Hudson River over to Lake Erie. And needed a lot of upkeep, repairs. There were also some other canals. And it turned out that a number of politicians in Albany were working a special arrangement on the bidding and contracting and making a lot of money. Well, Tilden delved into this, broke up the ring, smashed the canal ring, and again received a lot more acclaim for breaking the corruption. And so when the Democratic Party met for its national convention in St. Louis, well, there wasn't any doubt as to who was going to be nominated. Tilden was nominated for President of the United States. Tilden, the Democrats said, is just the man we need to clean up Washington and after all the corruption under Grant. Well, the Republicans were kind of in an awkward position. They got a Republican administration in Washington beset by corruption. They don't really have a corruption fighter to run against them, but they did find a candidate in the governor of Ohio, the three-term governor, Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, many of you from Ohio know that Hayes was born in Delaware, north of Columbus. He graduated from Kenyon College, first in his class, went off to Harvard Law School, came back and set up his law office 45 minutes from here in Fremont. Well, Hayes didn't stay in Fremont long. He soon moved on to what was then the biggest city in the state, Cincinnati. And there he would build a reputation excuse me, for defending the poor, defending runaway slaves. Hayes and his wife were ardent abolitionists. He served a couple years as city solicitor, and then the Civil War came along. Went in as a major, came out as a brevet major general. He joined the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and there's a connection here to Lakeside. In the 1880s, Hayes led a series of reunions for the 23rd here at Lakeside. Well, during the war, Hayes engaged in 9 battles in Maryland, Virginia, and what is now West Virginia, was wounded several times, had horses shot out from under him. Each time he got patched back up and went back to the fight. Well, Republicans in Cincinnati learned of his exploits and nominated him for Congress, wanted him to resign from the Army and come home and campaign. Hayes had none of it. He said, any officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat of Congress ought to be scalped. Not what we'd say today, but his sense of duty resonated with voters, and he was elected. Didn't go to Washington until the war was over. Then he was elected to a second term. Came back to Ohio, ran for governor, was elected. Elected to a second term. And for some reason, he ran for Congress again and lost. So a number of people urged him, well, run for governor again, and he did. He was elected a third time. First person in Ohio to be elected governor 3 times. They were 2-year terms in those days. So in 1876, happened just by happenstance, the Republican National Convention was in Cincinnati. And Hayes goes to the convention in Cincinnati as a delegation from Ohio, puts his name in offering as the favorite son candidate for president. Hayes wasn't anywhere near one of the favorites at all. The favorite at the time was the flamboyant James Blaine of Maine, who was a major figure in Washington for many years. So he comes in, and he's got a lot of votes going for him, but he just can't go far enough to get enough votes and the delegates to get the nomination. And so ballot after ballot goes by, and finally the convention turns to a compromise, Rutherford Hayes. Now here's a man who was, had a war record, served in Congress, 3 times elected as governor, and yet he was little known outside his home state. And you'd think that would be a disadvantage, but in those days, candidates didn't go running around the country campaigning. Surrogates did that for them. Candidates would issue position papers on something and let the surrogates do it. But the real key was the political parties. Political parties nominated the candidate, raised the money, ran the campaign. And so the candidates sit home and wait to see what happens. In this particular case, we have Hayes versus Tilden. A corruption fighter and a guy with a pretty clean record that offered as the alternative on the Republican side. There's a lot of interest in this campaign. It eventually would produce 81% of registered voters who would turn out. And among the issues, corruption in Washington, of course. Everybody's against it, right? There was civil service reform. There were some other issues germane to that time, such as should silver be one of the backup for American currency as well as gold. There was also concern about the fallout from the Depression, which began with the Panic of 1873. Well, as I said, big turnout of voters. And when the returns come in, Tilden wins the popular vote. Tilden leads in the Electoral College. But Tilden is 1 electoral vote shy of a majority needed to win. Hayes is 20 votes short. Well, normally, what would happen? What we saw earlier, the decision would fall to the House of Representatives. But this was not a normal election. There were 4 states where there were, to put it kindly, election irregularities. And their electoral votes, had not yet been counted. In Oregon, there was an elector who was deemed not to be an elector. Turns out he was a postmaster. He was a federal employee. And he said, well, he was planning to resign as a postmaster after the election. But the governor said, no, you got to do that before the election, because remember, the Constitution said a federal employee cannot be an elector. So this elector was planning to cast his vote for Hayes. The Democratic governor replaced him with someone who was going to vote for Tilden. Well, that was a brouhaha. So now we have 3 southern states. In all 3 states, the Democrats were accused of trying to suppress the Republican vote through all kinds of acts of intimidation, and particularly against black voters, who tended to vote Republican because of Lincoln. Well, on the other side, the Republicans also faced criticism. During Reconstruction, a number of Republicans came into office in traditionally Democratic states. Governor, various other public offices, including those that recounted the election votes. And the Republicans are accused of manipulating the returns in favor of Tilden, or in favor of Hayes. So the parties argue about what's going to happen there. In South Carolina, there was even a report of 110% turnout. Who'd suspect anything for that? So the parties debated, what are the official returns? What's the real vote? And there comes a point where every state has to submit to Washington, to the President of the Senate, the Vice President, the electoral returns. But these states didn't have the answer to that. So in all 4 states, there were dueling returns. A Democratic slate pledged to Tilden. A Republican slate pledged to Hayes. And they sent them off to Washington to let Washington sort it out. And Washington didn't know what to do. There was nothing in the Constitution about this, nothing in the precedent to address this. And so the 2 parties argued about it. Well, the Democrats controlled the House. And they said, send it over. Hey, you don't have a majority of the electoral vote? Says the Constitution. The Republicans said, no, you'll just give it to Tilden. Democrats said, well, okay, well, let's just have a joint session of Congress then. No, there's still too many Democrats. Republicans control the Senate. Now, normally, the president of the Senate would be the vice president of the United States. But Grant's second vice president died in office. And so Senator Thomas Ferry of Michigan was the ranking Republican there. And the Democrats said, well, we're not letting that guy decide which slate to pick. He'll just pick the slate for Hayes and give the election to Hayes. And so they argued about it the rest of December into January. Now, fortunately, there was time to resolve this, because for 2/3 of our history, the inauguration date was in March 4th. So they got to figure this out. So Grant says to the Congress, look, you guys can't resolve this. Why don't you appoint a special electoral commission to settle this? So Congress does. 15-member commission, 5 from the Senate, 5 from the House, 5 from the Supreme Court. And initially, it looks like the commission's going to be balanced. 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, 1 independent. Then the Illinois legislature got involved. In those days, senators were elected by state legislatures, not popular vote. And there was an opening in Illinois, and the Illinois legislature picks a former Illinois resident, the independent justice on the Supreme Court, David Davis. Now, Davis had lived in Illinois for many years. Originally Maryland, went to Kenyon College in Ohio. Lived in Illinois for many years. Lawyer, judge on state courts, close friend of Abraham Lincoln, helped run his campaigns. So Davis was a Republican for a long time. Lincoln becomes president, appoints Davis to the Supreme Court. But Davis becomes disenchanted with the Republicans and declares himself as an independent. And after about 14 years, he gets a little bored with being on the court, kind of decides that an elective office might be more interesting. And so he even wangles a nomination for president on a minor party while he's sitting on the court. Well, the Democrats in Illinois said, maybe, we give him this position that he has dreamed of, something new, he'll be grateful, and maybe he'll even, out of appreciation, will cast his vote on the commission for Tilden. Well, that was really a pipe dream. And as it turned out, though, Davis refuses the seat on the Electoral Commission and resigns from the court and accepts the Senate seat. So the other justices turn to a man that they think is a fair individual, and he fills the vacancy. So by now, we're into February. And the commission meets 4 times, once for each of the disputed states. But now we got a different balance on the commission. 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And in each of the 4 cases, the commission votes 8 to 7 along party lines to give all the electoral votes to Hayes, a total of 20 total. And they send their decision back to the whole Congress for certification. And immediately, the Democrats cry foul. The Republicans have stolen the election. And the Southern Democrats are particularly incensed. This, they say, these are 3 traditionally Democratic states. And Tilden can't get 1 electoral vote out of 3 traditionally Democratic states. The Republicans have stolen the election. So the Southern Democrats start to filibuster, brings everything to a halt. And here's where historians differ on what happens next. Some say that the matter went directly to the joint session of Congress, the decision of the Electoral Commission. Others say, no, they agree with a historian named C. Van Woodward, who published a book in the 1950s that said there was a secret meeting that was called by Republican leaders to meet with Southern Democrats. Secret meeting that was held away from the Capitol at the Hotel Warmly in downtown Washington. And according to this scenario, the Republicans said, look, we formed this Electoral Commission because we couldn't agree on the outcome of the election, and we agreed to abide by the results. So what's it going to take for you to stop this filibustering and accept the Electoral Commission's decision? And according to this scenario, the Southerners said, we want 3 things. We want the last federal troops that are in the South supporting Reconstruction to be withdrawn. We want a Southerner in the cabinet. And we want some capital construction in the South. Remember, the South is still recovering from the Civil War. We especially want funds for a railroad across the South like you all have in the Transcontinental Railroad up north. Republicans said, it's a deal. And so they go back to the Capitol building, and here's where the two versions of history converge. In the wee hours of March 2nd, 2 days before the scheduled inauguration, just 2 days before the scheduled inauguration, the Congress votes to accept the commission's vote on the disputed states and announce that the next president of the United States will be Rutherford B. Hayes by 1 electoral vote. Closest election in our nation's history. Well, immediately Hayes is denounced as Rutherford, and he's portrayed in cartoons and other places as sitting on a throne and people bowing to his fraudulency. Nonetheless, Hayes goes forth with the Compromise of 1877, although those who don't believe in that scenario in the hotel in Washington, D.C. say this never happened. Hayes had always promised to do some of these things. In any case, he comes into office in March and withdraws troops in April. Other presidents had withdrawn. President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, sympathetic to some of the old arguments in the South. He was against the secession of those states, but he was eager to bring them back into the fold, and he brought back withdrew a number of troops from different states. U.S. Grant withdrew troops. In fact, between the election of 1876 and Hayes coming into office, he withdrew troops from Florida. Now, they didn't leave the South. They just went back to their barracks, but they weren't guarding the state houses. They weren't out protecting the rights of the former slaves in the South there. So with the withdrawal with troops of the Louisiana and South Carolina, you find officially an end to the Reconstruction era, and unofficially opening the door wider to the Jim Crow era. Hayes appoints a former senator and Confederate officer, David Key of Tennessee, to be the Postmaster General. Little happened about the capital construction money. Nothing happened about a railroad, so that particular promise wasn't kept. But on the other hand, the southern states weren't keeping their promises about respecting the rights of the former slaves. So a little word about Hayes' presidency. He had said before the election that he, if elected, he would serve only one term, and indeed he did not run for re-election. He vetoed repeated attempts to repeal civil rights laws or water them down. He pushed for civil service reform, vetoed a proposed ban on Chinese immigration. You think immigration is just a term of these times? It goes way back. He also sent troops in to put down some violence in the first national labor strike. There was a railroad strike. He had to send troops into 4 states to try to calm things down. And then there was this proposal that was offered first under the Grant years and then implemented under Hayes. And this was the Indian boarding schools, in which Native American children were taken from their homes, sent off to hundreds or thousands of miles away to be Americanized and Christianized. You know, their hair was cut, their clothes were taken off, they couldn't speak their language. Basically, tribes felt that they were, trying to rub out their culture. A number of those kids never went back to their families again. For supporters of that, this was seen as a benevolent attempt at assimilation. For others, the native tribes considered an attempt to wipe out their culture. In today's terms, more recent terms, we'd probably call it an erasure of their history. In his post-presidency, Hayes was very active. He was only in his 50s when he left the White House. He promoted public education, prison reform, civil rights of the former slaves. Well, why go down this road into the musty, dusty past? Why talk about this election of 1876? What does that have to do with us? Well, in the years after that election, there was a lot of concern about what had happened. They felt that there needed to be more guidelines than what was in the Constitution regarding electoral votes and resolving disputes. They didn't want to have another situation like it had in 1876, where you had to have a special electoral commission, or in one scenario where some states sold their electoral votes in exchange for political favors for their states. So there were proposals 4 times by Senate Republicans to try to address these needs, and 4 times Democrats in the House rebuffed it, mainly because of concerns of southern states about the intrusion of the federal government into the states, they felt. Well, somehow in late 1886, the stars started to align, and early the next year we had the passage of the Electoral Count Act of what happened to my words here? Electoral Count Act of 1887. So this sets procedures for deadlines for certifying results, sending results to Congress, streamlining this particular thing. Electors are to meet in mid-December. Now, we all know that the elections in November are held the first Tuesday after the first Monday. This one is the first Monday after the second Wednesday. Electors will meet in mid-December. But there's also a provision that states must resolve their disputes and certify the results 6 days before the meeting of the electors. Back in 2000, when the Supreme Court ruled in Bush v. Gore, one of the points they made was that there was a deadline for doing just that. This is the section of law they were citing, that Bush-Gore decision. They had to be made by a certain date, and then come up to that date in 2000. That was the law they were talking about. Well, the law of 1887 lists a various range of reasons why disputes could be settled, but they don't want to let just anything go here. It also specifies that the joint session of Congress would be on January 6th. It had bounced around over the years. Congress is only supposed to accept one slate of electors, but the law isn't very specific as who decides which one slate that is going to be. And nonetheless, it does say that if you file false documents, that is, alternate slates, it's punishable as a felony up to 5 years in prison. And it is under that section that a number of alternate electors from the 2020 election are being prosecuted in several states, Georgia, Arizona, and among others. The vice president is supposed to oversee the tally of electoral votes. That was in the original Constitution. This says a little more about it, but it still doesn't narrowly define just what are the extent of his powers. And it says here that you can have challenges to the vote. When the Congress meets in January, you can challenge the vote in a particular state. One representative and one senator from different states would challenge it. This section has been used only 4 times since 1887, twice after the last election. Once was in 2005 after the 2004 election when the vote in Ohio was challenged because of a really confusing election. There were long lines, there were voting machines that broke down, et cetera, et cetera. And so the argument was that a lot of people had been deprived of their right to vote. That particular challenge did not go anywhere either, but none of them did go anywhere. Well, after the last election, of course, we know that this particular act from 1887 is what was in effect from that time forward, or put another way, every election in our lifetime. And it seemed to work okay until the last time, when we saw all kinds of protests and challenges to the procedure. Now, a lot of the challenges, I went to 60-some court cases, all but one thrown out by both Republican and Democratic judges in state and federal courts. But there were enough challenges, enough questions raised as a result of that after that election that in 2021, 2022, members of Congress started looking at ways to reform and revise the 1887 law. And it was initiated by senators, both Republican and Democrat, in the Senate, led by Senator Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia. Eventually had 39 co-sponsors of both parties. And it provided. The vice president has only a ceremonial role. There's no power to reject some electoral ballots and accept others. can't resolve any disputes. It's just a ceremonial role. Basically, the vice president opens the envelopes, the votes are tallied, and he announces the result. Congress can set only electoral slate signed by a governor. Somehow my slides have gotten mixed up. One is reproducing over another here. Congress accepts only the slate signed by the governor, and they specify this as the governor, or in the case of Washington, D.C., the mayor of Washington. But they specify this to prevent a situation where the governor of one party signs off on one slate, Secretary of State, another party signs off on another. They're going to accept one vote, no alternate slates. We had a number of court cases involved in the last election. This one provides for expedited judicial review by a panel of 3 appellate judges, and it could even go to the Supreme Court. But cases can be filed only by presidential candidates. You know, the last time around after 2020, we had cases filed all over the country, sometimes by aggrieved voters, by other folks. And so this specifies only by the presidential candidate. And lastly, we've got objections can still be filed on January 6th, but they've raised the bar. You notice on the previous slide that the challenges can be raised by 1 representative and 1 senator. You know, 500 and some people in this joint session, 2 people could raise objection. Now they've raised the bar to be 1/5 of both the House and Senate. So you're talking 87 in the House, 20 in the Senate. Thus, you really have to prove to a lot of people that there really are grounds to raise an objection. There were a few other things they threw in there. They repealed a section of an 1885 law that might have impacted the state votes. They also smoothed out some language regarding the presidential transition from one party, one president, to another. And so we come back to the original question. How does the 1886 election affect us? Well, first of all, there was the Act of 1887 governing every election in our lifetime. And then we have the more recent bill, the Reform Act of 2022, which will cover this November's election, the meetings of the Electoral College in December, and the joint session of Congress next January. This election and every election going forward. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Boy, was that fascinating. So great information. Any questions for Bill? Thank you.
Studying the big picture makes me feel much less anxiety and fear about today.
I agree 100%. Other comments or questions, if you could raise your hand. Great, Dave.
You know, in the 1876 election, the Democrats were the ones who were crying foul, of course. But had the Democrats gotten into office, the whole Reconstruction program probably would have ended even sooner.
Withdraw troops, and of course, did I lose it here? Okay. Yeah, both candidates were going to withdraw troops. And of course, Reconstruction was not only hated in the South, but it had lost a lot of support in the North. A lot of Northerners thought the program was not effective, and it was corrupt. And so it was just a matter of time till Reconstruction got wrapped up and ended.
Other questions?
I really thought that somebody might ask, you know, what are the chances of repealing the Electoral College? We've heard that one from time to time. Let me just address that. There actually have been hundreds of bills offered in the Congress over the last 2 centuries to repeal the Electoral College. And most of the time, the reason that it didn't go anywhere was this argument that it would only benefit the bigger states. The smaller states, you know, their issues, their concerns, their votes would not count as much as the bigger states. There have also to repeal it, you'd have to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to agree on it. And to get 2/3 of Congress to agree on anything these days would be a challenge. Then you have ratification by 3/4 of the states. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've received several texts and emails this year saying, sign up for this. We've got to, you know, send a letter to your petitions to our congressman to repeal the Electoral College. So there's some interest out there. Some people wanted to do it. The idea being that they don't want to have situations where the candidate with the most electoral votes loses to somebody who, candidates with the most popular votes loses to somebody with electoral votes. So there's an end run proposed around the repeal process with an amendment. And it's called something like the National Popular Vote Initiative. And under this one, it says, okay, states will rewrite their laws so that electors would only vote for the candidate that wins the popular vote nationally. So if candidate X wins in their state, they would instead vote, and candidate Y wins nationally, they'd ignore the state vote and vote for the one nationally. I think only a couple of states have even considered that one so far. Bill Smith.
You note there are 2 states that award in proportion to the, or not in proportion to the vote, but based on winning congressional districts.
Right.
Well, I wonder what the impact would be if that would become the system. Would be interesting to do the last dozen elections on that basis to see, would it make a change?
I'm sure that somewhere there's a political scientist or somebody on a PhD paper who has looked into that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right. Anybody else?
I'm curious. Am I on? Okay. Well, good. I don't have my hearing aids on, so I can't hear myself. Sorry. But I am curious that with the electoral process, electoral college, if there is any impact upon where people choose to live. There are a lot of people that move from one part of the country to another part of the country, you know, for employment or, you know, a variety of reasons. But if the electoral college system has an impact upon people's choices in terms of where they choose to move or live, just curious.
I don't know. There may be. If somebody says, you know, I'm one political party and I'm uncomfortable in this state, I'll move to another one where they view things the way I do. That may be. That may be. And certainly the movement of people has affected some states that, you know, were one party and now it's kind of purple, you know, votes are changing. Arizona, we live part of the year in Arizona, and that's kind of in flux. Traditionally blue, red, you know, it's kind of leaning purple these days. We'll see after this election. Maybe some of that movement will change, but you never know. Dee Dee.
Thinking about the question that you just asked, people, we come here in the summertime, then we live somewhere else in the wintertime, and it's not the same.
Right.
I'm from Springfield, Illinois, and then to come to Ohio in the summer, so it affects us here.
Right, very definitely.
Well, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Bill,
Thank
you've
you.
done a great job. One quick note as people are leaving. I believe the Wednesday morning lecture will be here. So if you could double check the website before you come on Wednesday. That's the Chuck Mintz photography exhibition. I didn't realize they had planned to move it here. from there. So if you're coming Wednesday, check the website, double check, but I think it'll be here at 10:30. Yes?
I will, if Mike can turn on. Yeah, Mike, okay. The faithless electors, a couple of them. We have faithless electors both for vice president and president. In, I think it was 1836, the vice presidential candidate running for, with Martin Van Buren, who was elected president,